Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vous en prie, messieurs.
Good
Installez-vous.
morning, ladies and gentlemen. Gentlemen, please take your seat.
Nous allons travailler en français
We will
et
work
en
in
anglais. Donc, vous
French and
choisissez
also in English during
le
this
canal qui vous
panel
convient.
session.
Je
Please
suis
feel
très
free
heureux
to listen to
de
the language of your
modérer
choice. I'm very
ce
pleased
panel de la
to
5e édition du Forum de Paris
facilitate
pour la paix.
this fifth
Je suis Thomas
edition
Gomard, le directeur
panel
de l'Institut
of the
français
Paris Peace Forum. I'm
des
Thomas
relations
Gomard,
internationales.
director of the French
Et nous
Institute
avons
of
donc
International Relations.
discussion aujourd'hui
We will
consacrée
hold a
en anglais
discussion
New
today
Challenges
in
to
English
Peace,
called New Challenges to Peace, New
qui porte
Responses.
sur
This
les enjeux
roundtable will
de sécurité
discuss
globaux, de sécurité au
global
sens
security
long
challenges,
terme.
global in the
Il y a une phrase qui
sense
accompagne
of
le programme, la première
globalized
phrase qui a
issues.
décrit la discussion
The
de ce
first
matin, avec laquelle je suis
sentence
en désaccord.
that I am
Cette
in a
phrase, c'est que la
disagreement
nature
with
du
is that
conflit
the
s'est
nature of
transformée de manière
conflict has
substantielle depuis
transformed
la Seconde Guerre
substantially
mondiale.
since World War
Et
II.
à titre personnel,
And
je n'en suis pas du tout convaincu.
this is in the article
Je
of our
pense qu'en
panel. And
réalité,
personally
cet
speaking, I'm not at
état
all convinced
de
of
guerre,
that.
cet état de
I think
paix,
that this
la
state
culture
of
de guerre, la
war, the
culture de
state of
paix,
peace, this culture of peace
sont des
and culture
choses
of
qui,
war
dans leur équilibre, traversent toutes les périodes historiques,
are aspects
la
that
nôtre
cross all
incluse.
historical periods,
Et de
including
ce point de vue,
our
ce qui me
period.
semble intéressant aujourd'hui dans le cadre
And
du
from that
Forum de Paris
viewpoint,
pour
what
la
I
paix,
think is interesting
c'est
at
d'essayer de
the
réfléchir à la
Paris Peace
manière
Forum
dont le
is
système
that we can
multilatéral
try to
peut
look at the way the
s'adapter à cet
multilateral system can
état
adapt
de guerre et
to
cet état
this
de paix
stage
fluctuant.
of this
Il se trouve
fluctuating
que
state
j'étais
of peace and
mercredi dernier
fluctoulating
à
state
Toulon
of
pour la
war.
présentation
I was in
par
Toulon,
le président
south
de la
of
République
France,
de la
last week
revue nationale
for the
stratégique de la
presentation of the
France.
Strategic National Review of
Je
France
l'évoque
presented
parce
by
qu'il a utilisé
President
une
Macron.
formule
Why am
qui
I
pourrait
mentioning
servir
this?
de
Well,
fil
because
rouge à
President Macron
notre
used a
discussion de ce
formula,
matin.
an expression that could
Président
serve as a
Macron
red thread
considère
for
que nous
our
sommes
discussion this morning.
aujourd'hui
President
face à
Macron
une
believes
guerre
today
hybride
we are faced
mondialisée.
with a globalized hybrid
Je
war.
pense que ce point de départ
And
peut
I
être
think that
intéressant pour
this
notre
could be
discussion,
an
savoir
interesting
si nous
starting
partageons
point for our discussion.
cette manière
I'd
de
like to know
décrire
if
la
we share
situation
the same
ou si nous
way of
souhaitons
describing our
l'amender.
current situation,
Alors pour ce faire,
or if we'd
je suis
like
très heureux
to
aujourd'hui
change this expression.
d'accueillir
And to
sur
do
la
so,
scène
to hold this discussion, I'm very
Ignacio
pleased to
Cassis, qui est le
welcome
président
Mr.
de la
Ignacio Cassis,
Confédération
President
suisse.
of the
Monsieur le
Swiss
Président, merci d'être avec
Confederation.
nous
President, thank
ce
you
matin.
for attending this
J'accueille
panel
également
session with us this
Monsieur
morning.
Mankour Ndiaye.
I also have the pleasure
Monsieur le
to welcome
ministre,
Mr.
vous avez été
Mankar
ministre des Affaires
Ndiaye.
étrangères
You
du
were
Sénégal.
Foreign
Et
Minister,
plus récemment, vous avez été le représentant spécial
Minister
du
of Foreign
secrétaire général
Affairs
des
in
Nations Unies pour
Senegal
la
and
RCA.
Special
Et puis j'accueille
and
également
for the
Ghassan
United Nations
Salamé,
Secretary
que
for
tout
the
le monde connaît ici évidemment,
CAR. I'm
puisqu'il
Mr.
est
Ghassan Salamé,
professeur
who
émérite à
everybody
l'Institut
knows.
d'études
He's
politiques de Paris,
emeritus
entre
professor
autres
at the
charges académiques, et qu'il a
Economic
été
Institute of
jusqu'en
Paris.
2020 le représentant spécial de
It was
l'ONU
special representative for the
pour
United
la Libye.
Nations until
Alors
2020
ce que
for
je vous
Libya.
propose avec peut-être le fil rouge
So,
que j'ai essayé de
with
dérouler,
this red thread
de
which I
commencer par
tried
vous,
to
Monsieur
unfold, I'd
le
like to start
Président,
with you,
en vous demandant une question assez simple,
President, by
au
asking a
fond, mais
very
qui
straightforward
vous permettra
question, a
probablement
question which
d'esquisser
will
différents modes
enable
d'action.
us to develop a certain set
Quels
of
sont les principaux défis
actionable
de
measures. What do you
sécurité
believe are the
auxquels nous
main
sommes confrontés
security
aujourd'hui
challenges that we are
au niveau global?
faced with
Une
today
question
at the global
subsidiaire,
level?
compte tenu
And
de sa tradition diplomatique.
a subsidiary
Quel rôle
question,
la
given its
Confédération suisse peut-elle
diplomatic
jouer pour précisément
role,
adapter le
historically
système
speaking, what
multilatéral à ces
can
défis de
Switzerland,
sécurité que vous allez décrire?
Swiss Confederation can play as
Merci
a
tout
role
d'abord,
to
merci
in this
pour
multilateral
cette invitation. Bonjour
or
tout le monde.
order? Thank you for this invitation, and thank you and welcome
Je
to
crois que
everybody.
quand on parle de
I think that
new
when
challenges, de nouveaux
one
défis,
speaks of
de
new
nouveaux
challenges and new
euh,
solutions or responses,
il ne faut pas, je crois, se confondre.
I believe
L'être
we
humain n'est pas
must
nouveau.
ensure we don't
Je parle toujours de l'être
confuse
humain parce que
concepts.
Les guerres ne
Human
sont pas
beings
faites par les États, mais par des
have
organisations
always been
collectives faites
human
d'êtres
beings,
humains,
and
qui
wars
s'appellent
are
États, qui s'appellent
waged by
ce qu'ils veulent
not
appeler.
by states but by human
Mais
beings, whether
derrière
we
tout
call
ça,
them
il y a
ministers,
les êtres humains, et l'être
heads of
humain n'est
states,
pas
etc.
changé.
And behind
D'un point de vue
warfare, you find the
neuroanatomique, on a
human being,
plus ou moins
and from a
le même cerveau qu'on avait il y a 1000 ans derrière.
neuroanatomical viewpoint, the human being is the same and hasn't changed. So I don't think this situation will change anytime soon. And therefore, we are in a situation which is as follows. Nature has created a human being whose brain prefers to be in conflict rather than to strive for peace. This has always been the case and will continue to be the case. Let us not be misled. So the question is, what are the solutions that our world can implement to ensure we avoid repeat wars? Multilateralism has been the major instrument of peace for the 20th century. We started off with the Société des Nations, the first edition of the United Nations in 1920. It was set up to avoid a second World War, which of course we know took place nevertheless. But nevertheless, after World War II, we created what we know today as the United Nations Organization. And this instrument, the UN, is the main peace and security instrument that exists around the world. But it is somewhat obsolete because its entire structure is based on a world that existed in 1940 or 1950. 1949 and 1950. So we're faced with an aging instrument relative to a society which is becoming not older but modernizing. Warfare does not change, it's just the instruments of war that are changing. For example, hybrid warfare. In the past, television was already a very powerful instrument, and today we have very powerful communication instruments. We can see it with cyberattacks, cybercrime, espionage, disinformation, entering into a computer, and all of this has always been done by human beings. But today, human beings use very powerful instruments, so we need to have powerful responses, such as what we did for the pandemic. We move around a great deal today, so the viruses know no borders, so we cannot just close and shut down borders and say the virus will be shut down, kept away. That's not true. So we had to step up research to find efficient solutions and an efficient vaccine. So those are the questions we're faced with today. And I think we're witnessing a changing society with always new and renewed challenges that need to call for renewed solutions. So what can we do today? Well, we can set out a diagnosis and ask ourselves the following question: why the instruments that we have developed since the aftermath of World War II do not manage to prevent tragedies such as we've seen in Ukraine, Yemen, Libya, Syria? Why is that? Why do we find human beings that are always going at war since the dawn of age? This is a continuous question on the part of our humanity. We need to understand how human beings function and to accept this state of play. I would say that for the current situation, Switzerland is playing the following role. It is the second UN headquarters after New York. Geneva is the capital of world or global governance. And in Geneva, there's an entire host of NGOs, academia, and stakeholders working in the private sector. And increasingly, they're working hand in hand, precisely to try and modernize instruments, to innovate in this perpetual task, which is to ensure that we prevent human beings from committing too many mistakes in our human history. More practically speaking, in respect of the war in Ukraine, beyond the general contribution to the dialogue about war and peace, our contribution is to anticipate reconstruction of Ukraine. We mentioned this conference in Lugano in my native city, in Italian French-speaking city in Switzerland. It's my language, Italian. And we held rather a meeting there to speak about Ukraine's reconstruction. The civilian infrastructure in Ukraine has been destroyed to the tune of one-third of its infrastructure. So you have Ukrainians in houses that are destroyed with no heat and hot water. So there's a tremendous humanitarian action that needs to be carried out, and Switzerland is part of that effort with a great deal of commitment. But there's something that goes beyond the immediate concern of this winter. Which country will rise out of war? So the fact that we anticipate discussions about reconstruction is a way first to give hope to Ukrainians on the ground and who see that there's an international community imagining the future for them. So we invite Ukrainians, insofar as this is possible, to remain in their country. This is what President Zelensky has been hoping and calling for. But nevertheless, 6 million Ukrainians had to leave, especially youth who are needed in Ukraine to rebuild the country. But of course, we need to put an end to weapon use before we can start doing concrete actions in Ukraine. But we must be careful to keep in mind that Ukraine is a very large country. So it won't be so simple and straightforward. We stop the war, we start rebuilding Ukraine. Ukraine is so large that one can imagine very well that there are reconstruction areas while there are also regions still at war. So it is very fundamental to anticipate this discussion and to set out principles. We set out these Lugano principles, and also in Berlin 15 days ago, which instruments, who will shoulder the responsibility for developing these instruments and financial means. Before we mobilize financial aid, it takes many years of planning, as we learned in the 1940s. Thank you, Ignacio. I'd like to wonder if we're using the right word. This pessimism could be corrected, politically speaking, by multilateralism, perhaps by through education or awareness raising. We'll speak on that later. And second point, it's very important for Switzerland to be the second headquarters of the United Nations. So there's this entire UN system, which, as you said, is in line with what was needed in a world of back in the 1945, and is now a changed world. The UN system needs to adapt. I'd like to also ask a few questions in this respect. Now, I'd like to turn over to you, Minister, by asking you to speak about your very recent experience in the Central African Republic. I'd like to ask you, insofar as what you've witnessed in the CAR, does that reflect conflict today, modern warfare? Because we are faced here with a country that is ridden by a great deal of internal tensions and conflicts, with a great deal of foreign interference that you will probably describe. And there is also the mission of the United Nations in this country. So the international community deems it necessary to mobilize in the Central African Republic. How is the CAR's situation, in your view, reflecting the current conflicts in our world today? Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that the Swiss president presented the fundamental challenges of our current world, and he stressed multilateralism. Today, we can all agree to say that the ideal framework for multilateralism is the United Nations organization, but we need to look at the way the UN managed to manage such severe crises, such as the health crisis, that we are only rising out of now, progressively and gradually. Everybody noticed how paralyzed the UN system ended up being during the peak of COVID. The UN Security Council had to meet virtually, to each his or her own, staying at home. The same happened for sessions of the General Assembly. They were virtual. well. And since the launch of the war in Ukraine, one can also see how the United Nations system is paralyzed. The Security Council couldn't take any decisions. The UN did not want to tackle head-on the crisis in Ukraine. And there are multiple challenges and multiple crises that have come to as an additional layer to existing challenges. Today, we're faced with crises and health risks and crises, ecological, environmental disasters and crises, food crisis, and energy crisis, global crisis, international terrorism, radicalization, transnational migratory flows, use of nuclear weapons, cyber attacks, cybercrime, and disinformation campaigns and the proliferation of fake news today. So this is a very explosive cocktail that the world is faced with. And if we bring all of this back to the situation in Africa, one can see that the strongest vulnerabilities are found in Africa, because when you look at the energy or food crisis or the crisis of funding, it is found where? In the African continent today. And despite progress accomplished in recent years, we can see very serious deterioration on the ground with a coup on Western Africa. We thought it was the end of coup in Africa. Then we've seen these in Mali, and then in Guinea, and in Burkina Faso, and attempts in Guinea-Bissau. So we can see that those are new emerging challenges that we absolutely need to tackle. Now let's look at the situation in the Central African Republic. As you know, the CAR is a country that has for decades been experiencing cyclical crises. There was another UN mission that was launched in 2014 with the MINUSCA as well for the stabilization of the Central African Republic. I had the privilege of leading the MINUSCA for 3 years, from 2019 until 2022. So this is a country which is struggling to rise out of the conflicts arising from war. It is also a country that has the wrong neighbors, so to speak. Who are the neighbors? Well, Chad. We can see what's happening in Chad. It also has a border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, with the strongest peacekeeping operation of the UN. Also Sudan, and we can see the situation in the South Sudan as well. Those are 4 countries surrounding this great sick country of the CAR. So since peacekeeping operations have been carried out in this country, there's no progress. Internal domestic political crisis that has yet to be solved. A few weeks ago, the President of the Republic decided by decree to put an end to the functions of the President of the Constitutional Court. This was a serious violation of the Constitution of the CAR. This president had another 2-year term, but the president decided unilaterally to put an end to her term. So this is a new political crisis in the CAR. We can also see power play and interest and stakes that are at play in this country. Everything that happens worldwide has an impact in the Central African Republic. You also have the Wagner group that is pushing away the UN mission. A great development of fake news is proliferating, and the Wagner group is preventing some people to exercise their term. And even the government of the CAR is opposed to the renewal of the MINUSCA's mandate, which is very serious. What is the MINUSCA? It's a $1 billion budget per year. It's a great deal of money.
chaque fois qu'on fait un pas en avant,
every
pensant
time we make a
qu'on va
step
vers
forward
la paix,
and we
on
think
fait
we
deux
are
ou trois
moving
pas
towards peace,
en
we
arrière. Donc, toutes les
take a few
situations de
steps
conflit
back
que nous voyons dans
from
le monde
peace.
se reflètent
So all
dans
those
ce
conflict
pays.
situations
La
around
seule
the world
chance
are reflected
de
in
ce pays-là,
CAR.
c'est qu'il n'y a pas encore de groupe terroriste.
The only chance for the CAR now is that there are no terrorist groups
Contrairement au Mali.
yet. That's the only
C'est des
chance the
groupes
CAR
armés
has
qui ne sont pas encore des groupes
compared to Mali.
terroristes.
Those are
Mais
armed
avec un
conflicts, but
pays
no.
aux frontières ouvertes, poreuses, un pays, un
But that
gouvernement
being
qui
said, the
contrôle
CAR
aucune
has
de
a
ses
porous
frontières.
borders with a government that controls
C'est des frontières
none
ouvertes
of its
où les gens
borders
passent.
whatsoever. People can come and go in the
Entre et
CAR.
sortent. Où
They
les
can
groupes
come and
armés
go,
aussi traversent
and armed
le
groups
pays
as
pour
well
aller trouver leur
can
base arrière
cross the
au
CAR to
Tchad,
go to their
ou en RDC, ou au
other
Soudan,
bases
ou
in
au
Chad, the
Soudan.
DRC, or in
Donc,
Sudan or
rien n'est
South
exclu
Sudan.
que
So
dans les prochaines années,
in the
que
coming
des
years,
groupes terroristes
one
qui
can
migrent partout à travers le monde
envisage
quittent le
that
Mali
there will
pour venir
be
s'installer dans cette zone, d'autant
different
que voilà, dans la
movements of
région, Boko
armed
Haram,
groups from
au
Mali
Cameroun,
to
qui est aussi un pays
Cameroon
frontalier
with
à la
Boko Haram.
République centrafricaine. Donc,
Cameroon
je
is
suis tout à
also
fait
has
d'accord
also a border with
que
the
la situation en
CAR.
Centrafrique reflète tout à fait la
So I
conflictualité
completely
du monde.
agree that
Et
the situation
ce
in
qui est
Central
important,
African
je pense,
Republic is
l'aspect
reflecting
le
what's
plus
happening
important,
in
c'est
the
la
world.
coopération.
And cooperation
Le
is the
monde
most important aspect.
également a vécu une
The world
absence
has
totale de
experienced
solidarité
a complete
régionale et
absence
internationale
of
durant la
regional
Covid.
and international solidarity.
C'est développé ce qu'on a appelé le nationalisme vaccinal, par exemple.
We saw this with
Chaque
vaccines.
pays
Each
s'occupait
country
de
was
ses
only
propres
looking
populations,
out
ne
for their
pensait pas aux
own
autres.
interests, their own
Pensant que si on arrive
populations.
à résoudre la Covid
Thinking, oh, well, if
à
we can
l'intérieur de
solve
ses frontières,
COVID
on en a
within
plus.
our
Non,
borders, then we're fine.
justement. Donc, je
But of
pense qu'il
course
faut
not.
rebâtir
So I think that we
la
have
solidarité
to
internationale et régionale.
reconstruct
Ça, c'est
international
extrêmement
and
important.
national
Et la
solidarity.
Covid nous
And
montre
COVID
qu'il faut
has
absolument
shown this.
davantage de
We absolutely
multilatéralisme,
need more
davantage de
multilateralism
solidarité entre les nations,
and more
entre
solidarity
les
across
États.
nations,
Donc voilà, sans
across
être
states.
long, cher ami, je voudrais m'arrêter là en attendant
So I will
de
stop
revenir sur
there,
d'autres aspects
dear friends,
du sujet.
while
Merci.
waiting to broach
Merci
other
beaucoup,
aspects
Monsieur
of
le
this
ministre. Je
subject.
retiens là
Thank you
aussi,
very much,
deux
Minister.
points,
I
l'insistance,
also retain
évidemment,
two
sur le
things
système
here. First of all, your
onusien
insistance
pour
on the UN
produire un
system
multilatéralisme
to
essentiel dans des
produce
périodes comme celle
essential
que nous avons
multilateralism
traversées de
in
crise
difficult
sanitaire et en même
periods
temps,
such as this one
le
and the
constat
health
que vous faites,
crisis.
à la suite
But you also
du
note,
président de la Confédération suisse sur
along
sur un
with
certain
the
nombre de
presidents
défaillances
of
de ce
the
système
Swiss
multilatéral.
Confederation, that
Et
there
puis également d'avoir attiré notre
they
attention
can't solve
sur la situation
everything.
RCA. Je ne sais pas si
And
la
there's
RCA est
also
mal
the
entourée.
situation in CAR.
géographie, mais en revanche, effectivement, il y a ce phénomène des SMP, des
there's
sociétés
the,
militaires privées, très particulier dans le cas de Wagner.
the question
puisque,
of these
au fond,
private
c'est une
militias,
SMP
such as the
qui est
Wagner groups.
directement,
And this is a group
instrumentalisée par
that
un État,
has
en l'espèce,
being
la
instrumentalized
Russie.
by
La
Russia
Russie
in
jouant
this
elle-même
case,
comme membre permanent du Conseil de sécurité,
and Russia being
un
a
rôle tout à
permanent
fait
member of the
essentiel
Security
en termes de
Council,
multilatéralisme et
should be
probablement, c'est
playing
une
an
manière de
essential
tourner vers
role in
vous, monsieur le
multilateralism.
professeur,
And
dans
now
sa
turning to
capacité à
you,
bloquer,
Professor,
par son usage répété du droit de
here we
veto,
see that Russia
le Conseil
has
de sécurité
used their
dans
veto on
son
several
fonctionnement.
occasions.
Et donc la question que je voudrais vous poser là aussi est double, compte
So the
tenu de votre
question for you,
expérience à la fois
given your
académique
experience
et
in academia as
diplomatique.
well as in diplomacy,
Que vous inspire cette formule du président Macron d'une
does
guerre
Macron's
hybride
formula inspire you as so the
mondialisée,
hybrid
et
and
dans quelle mesure
globalized
vous avez
war?
pu observer en termes de
To what
fonctionnement du
extent
Conseil de sécurité
have you been able
corrige
to
cette
witness
situation,
within
ou au
the
contraire,
UN
l'aggrave?
Security
Vous mentionnez,
Council correcting
juste
this
précédemment
problem,
l'attitude
or
que nous
if on the
observons de la
contrary,
Russie au Conseil de sécurité depuis au fond 2011?
since 2011, is Russia just being successful in blocking any sort of attempts? Well, I believe that what Macron wished to say was that the wars such as Clausewitz defined it is over. Wars that I learned about as a young person were in line with Clausewitz. Clausewitz defined war as being along the lines of Greek tragedies. So there are three units. There is the place, the time, and then the action. That's how Greek tragedies were defined. And that's how war was defined as well. There was the time, people knew when wars began with the declaration of war and when they ended with a peace agreement.
Unité de lieu, parce qu'il était clair qu'il y avait des endroits où se faisait la guerre.
Everybody knew where that war was being carried out. Diana, Austerlitz, others. And then in the rest of the country, they weren't affected by the war. Other people could carry on with their ordinary lives.
And there was une guerre
the actions were circumscribed.
rapport de force entre deux armées et l'une
So
devait
it was a
perdre
power
et l'autre
struggle
devait
between
gagner.
two armies, and one army would win and the other army
Nous
would
vivons
lose.
aujourd'hui dans un monde où
However,
ces trois
today,
unités
these
ont
three
disparu.
units have
Et
disappeared.
je crois que c'est le sens profond de ce
And I
qu'Emmanuel
think
Macron
this
a voulu.
is the
En ce
true
sens
meaning of what
qu'aujourd'hui, la guerre est
President
partout et
Macron
nulle part.
wanted to say. Because right now, war
Je
is
dirais
nowhere
d'ailleurs
and
la
everywhere.
conflictualité plutôt que la guerre.
Or
La
rather than
conflictualité
using the
est
word
partout et
war,
nulle
maybe
part.
the
Donc,
word
unité du
conflict.
temps,
There are
du lieu
conflicts
et du
everywhere
moment.
and nowhere.
Que on ne sait pas quand elle
So
commence
they
et
no
on ne sait
longer
pas quand
take
elle
place
finit.
in a specific location. And also, we don't
Parce
know where they
qu'il n'y a pas
start
de
and where they
déclaration de
end.
guerre et il n'y a pas de
There are
trêve
no
véritable.
declaration of war and there's no
Et
ceasefire.
troisièmement, il n'y a pas d'unité d'action parce que
And there are
toutes
no
sortes
action units
d'objectifs de
because
guerre
there are all
se
sorts
sont
of
mélangés.
objectives
Il y a la
in
guerre
war, and they're
commerciale,
all being
il y a les
confused.
guerres
There's trade
cyber,
war,
il
there's
y a les
cyber
guerres
war,
traditionnelles de conquête
and
comme
then
celle
there's
d'Ukraine,
conquest
qui
wars,
nous
such as
rappelle
in
le 19e
Ukraine,
siècle plutôt que le 21e.
which brings us back
Il y
to
a
the
toutes sortes de
19th
guerres
century
qui
rather
sont
than the 20th.
entrelacées entre elles. Et il n'y a
And
plus
then
d'unité
there are all
d'action.
sorts of intermediate stages
Donc,
between
on
the
peut
two.
ranger Clausewitz au fond de
So
notre
Clausewitz
bibliothèque en
can be
disant
put at the
ça ne sert plus à rien.
back of the
Nous
shelf
vivons
because
dans
it's
une
now
toute autre
useless.
époque, une époque
Times
où
have completely
l'unité de lieu,
changed,
l'unité d'action, l'unité
where
de
the
temps
place,
ont
the
toutes
time,
disparu.
the actions, all
La
of this is gone.
conflictualité est partout
Conflicts
et nulle part.
are everywhere and nowhere.
Cela est à la fois quelque chose d'inquiétant,
This is
parce
very worrying
qu'on ne peut pas véritablement
because
contenir
now
la
we
guerre
can't
dans un lieu ou dans un temps
contain a
particulier
war in a
et la
specific
définir par
place
rapport
and
à
time.
Mais ça veut dire aussi
But
que
it
la
also
différence
means
entre la
that
paix et la guerre
The
a
difference
également
between peace
disparu.
and war has also
Il y a aujourd'hui des
disappeared.
pays qui vivent
There are
ni
now
en paix,
countries
ni
that
en
are
guerre,
neither at peace
entre les
nor
deux.
at war. They're
Y
somewhere
compris
in
le pays
between,
où je suis né.
including the
Mais
country where I was
Des
born.
dizaines d'autres pays aussi
But there are dozens
qui
of other
vivent entre
countries
la paix et la guerre.
as well, living
Donc il
between
n'y a
peace
plus de
and war.
distinction réelle.
There's no true distinction
Et
anymore.
le système international n'est
And
pas
the
là pour
international
aider.
system cannot assist.
Il y a eu, certes, pendant une quinzaine
True,
d'années,
for about
entre la fin de
15
la guerre froide
years,
et je
between the
dirais
end of the
2005,
Cold War
2006,
and 2005,
trois raisons d'espérer.
2006, there were three reasons for
D'abord, la
hope.
globalisation.
First
allait
of all,
bon
there
train.
was globalization,
Et
which
comme
was
tout le
well
monde le sait
underway,
depuis
and as
Montesquieu,
everybody knows,
le
since
commerce adoucit
Montesquieu,
les mœurs.
trade softens
Donc, on imaginait que
people's
la prospérité
characters,
qui était réelle,
and prosperity
la part
was true.
grandissante du commerce
With an increasing
international
share of
dans le PNB
international
mondial,
trade
tout cela
in
allait
world
amener
GDP,
à la paix.
and all of this was
Le
going to
deuxième
bring
processus
peace.
qui marchait très
The
bien,
second
c'est la
process, which was
démocratisation.
working very well, was
Autour de l'an
democratization.
2001-2002,
Around 2001,
Pour la première fois de
2002,
l'histoire,
for the very first
il y
time
avait
in the
plus de la
history of
moitié de
humanity,
l'humanité
more than half of
qui vivait sous un
humanity
régime
was
démocratique
living
que sous un
under a
régime
democratic
autoritaire. Et ça
regime
arrivait pour la
And this
première
was the
fois
very
de toute
first
l'histoire
time
humaine.
in the entire human
Mais
history.
le mouvement de démocratisation,
Democratization
comme le mouvement de globalisation après la
and
crise financière de
globalization
2006,
after the
le
financial
mouvement de
crisis in 2006,
démocratisation s'est lui aussi ensablé à
it
partir
also
de
became
2005-2006.
mired beginning in
L'année idéale, c'est peut-être
2005-2006.
2005.
2005 was
voir
probably
qu'il y a eu
the
des coups
best
d'État qui ont
year
eu lieu
ever.
partout,
And then
en
there
Thaïlande,
were
en Myanmar,
coups d'État.
en Guinée, en
There
Burkina
was
Faso, et
Myanmar, there was
au
Guinea, there was
Mali, et
Burkina
j'en passe.
Faso, Mali.
Vous allez voir aussi
etc.,
que la
etc.
démocratie va
And
perdre en
democracy
qualité
is
dans beaucoup de
also
pays. De telle
losing
sorte
its quality
que
in many
l'économiste au début de
countries.
cette année nous disait qu'à peine 6,4%
So
de
barely
l'humanité
6.4%
vit véritablement dans un
of
régime
humanity is now living
On est
under
loin de
a
l'espoir
democratic
de
regime.
2005.
We are very far
Le
from the
troisième
hopes we had in
pilier de
2005.
notre espoir,
The third pillar
c'était
for
les
hope
sociétés
was
ouvertes.
open
Grâce
societies.
à la révolution de l'IT,
Thanks to the IT revolution,
de la
the
technologie.
digital revolution.
Certes, les avantages sont immenses en matière
True,
de
there are
liberté
huge
d'expression.
advantages
Et au
for
cours des
freedom of
10-15
speech,
dernières années,
but
nous
over the
avons
past
vu les
10,
effets
15 years,
collatéraux
we've seen
négatifs
very
de
negative
cette
collateral effects
expansion de la liberté d'expression,
of
que ce
this
soit dans une
increased
plus grande
freedom of speech,
surveillance des sociétés par
in
les
more
gouvernements,
monitoring of
grâce à
societies by
l'IT,
governments using IT,
que ce soit dans le développement du discours de la haine qui a pris une
or
dimension
the development
globale,
of hate speech, which
Que
has
ce
become
soit,
global, and
dans le
then
fait que ceux qui se ressemblent
fact
se
that
rapprochent, mais
birds of a
excluent les
feather
autres aussi,
flock
et
together,
les
but tend to
social media
exclude
n'ont fait
everything else, and
qu'aggraver
social media have only made this worse.
Donc, nous sommes aujourd'hui dans un monde très différent d'il y a une
So
quinzaine
our
d'années.
world is
Il y a
very
eu un
different than
vrai
it was
glissement
15 years
dont on n'a
ago.
pas assez souligné,
And we haven't highlighted this enough. And this has led to what I've called to complete deregulation of the use of force. It began with the Americans in Iraq. It continued with the Russians in Georgia, and then in 2014 in Ukraine, and now again in Ukraine. It developed with what the Chinese are doing in the China Sea, turning islands into military bases, and now middle powers, Turkey, Israel, and the little Spartas such as Chad, Rwanda, etc. So they're the little Spartas of Africa today. But what's happened is that there was a prohibition against using force. It was very strong, and that is Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. And this prohibition was always interpreted in a very narrow sense. For the European Court of Justice, let's look at Nicaragua, or the Security Council, look at the actions of Israel, South Africa, etc., and the General Assembly of the United Nations. However, that prohibition has eroded over the past few years. And we didn't realize it because our intentions were sound, or we were blind. The prohibition against using force was strongly eroded, first of all, by resolutions of the Security Council after the 11th of September and the use of force to defend oneself against terrorism, so preemptive force. And now the Security Council has authorized the use of force against terrorism in terms of self-defense, but there is no clear definition of terrorists. Everybody can just say, okay, this person that I've been at war with forever is now a terrorist. So this article, well, there was an exception in Article 51, which is now widespread because everybody's decided that their age-old enemy is now a terrorist, and they use the Article 51 of legitimate self-defense to authorize them to use force to defend themselves against terrorism. Today, 70 countries are fighting against terrorism.
Ça s'est fait aussi partout. Ça s'est fait même dans l'Organisation
everywhere, even within the World Trade Organization that has commodified the security provisions, saying that it's now a merchandise. So there's been a deregulation of the use of force, and it is now used massively in international law, unfortunately, rather than respecting the original narrow definition of the use of force has now broadened it to include humanitarian actions, preemptive strikes, to weaken the prohibition against the use of force. Thank you very much.
Un exposé très riche en peu de mots, ouais, voilà, je crois que c'est tout à fait mérité.
Extremely rich in just a few words, and yes, you do deserve a round of applause.
Parce qu'il y a quatre choses au fond qu'on retient de.
There are four things that can be retained from what you've said. First of all, that Clausewitz has to be revised.
Je vois évidemment bien l'idée. La deuxième chose, c'est ce tournant de 2005 dans cette chronologie au fond, c'est
turning point in 2005.
Encore dans un état d'esprit.
We might still have a mindset from beforehand, but things definitely changed in 2005, as you mentioned. And then thirdly, there's the question of open societies and the technological revolution, which is a tool for personal empowerment that is unprecedented in its power, as the president of the Swiss Confederation reminded us, but it's also a very powerful tool for surveillance. And you finished by insisting on the fact that the use of force is no longer prohibited, and it's no longer regulated as it was in the past. So I have a question for the three of you, a very broad question, based on this idea of reviewing Clausewitz.
à la manière dont on parle de plus en plus d'une guerre hors limite.
So people more and more talk about limitless wars.
Chinois en
There's
1999.
a book written by two Chinese officers in 1999 to say that armies, in the former tradition of the term, no longer had the monopoly of war.
Soit dit en passant, et que en même temps liste
Which
24
doesn't mean
types
they've
de
lost their
guerres,
power.
allant
But they
de la guerre
list 24
environnementale à la
types of war:
guerre
environmental
sanitaire,
war,
la guerre financière, la
health
guerre
war,
nucléaire,
financial
etc.,
war,
etc.
nuclear war,
Pourquoi je fais ce
etc.
détour, c'est que ma question,
So
là
when I'm
encore,
mentioning this,
je vous l'adresse à tous les trois, c'est est-ce qu'on n'est
to
pas
get to
dans un
my
moment
question
où la
for all
grammaire
three of you
de la guerre
is
change parce
the
que
grammar of
le
war
rapport de
changing
force global
because
change? Pour le
the
dire
global
autrement,
power struggles have
comme c'est un
changed,
rapport global qui est moins favorable aux
and it's
aux
less
Occidentaux,
favorable to
c'est
the
qu'une
West.
grammaire de la guerre qui leur est
So
moins
has the grammar
favorable.
of
C'est une autre
war is
grammaire
also
qui
the
est en
new
train
grammar
de
of war less
s'imposer,
favorable for the
peut-être plus
West,
latérale, effectivement, sans
Maybe
claire
more
distinction entre ce qui
without any
relève
clear distinctions between
du conflit et ce qui relève de la
what's a
compétition.
conflict and
Donc ça,
what is
c'est la première
competition.
question. C'est est-ce que
So that's the first
on n'a
question.
pas un changement de la conflictualité
Has there not been a change in the
lié au
nature of
changement du rapport de
conflicts
force
due
global?
to the
Et la
nature of
deuxième
changes
question,
between power
je
struggles
serais
around the world?
heureux de vous entendre
And then a
tous les
second
trois
question,
sur
and I'd be
votre
happy to
analyse de la
hear your views on
situation
this, and that's your
sur
analysis
la
of
grande guerre actuelle qui
your-
est en Europe, c'est-à-dire
of the current war in Europe.
l'invasion de l'Ukraine
So the
par
invasion
la
of
Russie,
Ukraine
parce
by
qu'encore une
Russia.
fois, c'est une situation
Because
qui, à mon
again, this
avis,
is a situation
est
which
très intéressante à bien comprendre pour deux raisons principales.
it's very
La première,
useful to
c'est que,
understand for
elle est
two main
conduite
reasons. First of
par
all,
un
it's
État
being
membre permanent du
carried
Conseil de
out by
sécurité, et qui
a
donc utilise
member
son
of the United
positionnement
Nations
diplomatique
Security Council, and
pour
they
imposer
are
ses vues,
using
avec
this position to
un
impose their
message
own
qui est
view.
reçu très différemment
And the message is
selon
received
les-
very
à travers les
differently
pays du monde, c'est-à-dire qu'un
around the
certain nombre de
world.
pays
Some
condamnent et sanctionnent la
countries
Russie, mais
wish
un
to
grand nombre
sanction
de
Russia
pays
and condemn its
condamnent et ne
actions, but
sanctionnent pas
others
la Russie.
condemn
Donc ça, je
Russia's
serais
actions,
intéressé d'avoir
but don't
votre
wish
avis
to
là-dessus. Le
impose
deuxième point,
sanctions.
c'est
So I would like to have your
nous
view
avons
on
une
that.
guerre,
And then secondly, we
avec
have
un arrière-plan nucléaire.
there's a war with
Ce qui
the threat
concerne
of
l'ensemble des pays du monde et pas
nuclear war.
simplement
So this obviously
les
would
pays, je
impact
dirais, de la zone
everybody and not
euro-atlantique.
just
Monsieur le
those
Président,
in the European and
vous
Atlantic area.
pourriez
So,
réagir à cette
President,
cette
could you
question
perhaps
sur,
react
sur ce
to these
double plan?
questions?
Oui, très volontiers. La
Yes,
grammaire de
thank
la
you.
guerre
The grammar
change
of war
comme
is
toute
changing,
grammaire de l'humanité.
like all
Je
grammars of
reprends de nouveau
humanity.
une autre auteur de vol. Bien sûr qu'elle change. Elle change la grammaire
Yes,
de la
obviously
paix.
it changes. It changes the grammar of peace, the grammar of life is changing. Think about the debate around abortion in the United States. There's the grammar of death, of euthanasia.
Oui, mais ça, c'est absolument normal et heureusement.
But this is absolutely normal.
Quand vous avez parlé de mon pessimisme, moi je
When you
l'appelle pas
talked about
pessimisme, ça me
pessimism, well, I
réalisme, c'est
wouldn't
tout
call it
simplement la
pessimism. I'm
nature
saying I'm
humaine.
being realistic
Et
because this
heureusement,
is human
parce que je
nature.
pense quand même qu'on vit dans un monde meilleur
And I think
aujourd'hui
that we
qu'il y a
do live in
100
a
ans,
better
200 ans,
world
300
than
ans,
100,
1000
200,
ans.
300 years
Donc,
ago.
je crois
1,000 years
qu'on ne doit
ago.
pas quelque part tomber dans la
I
naïveté
don't think we should be
de
naive
se dire
in
fermer la
thinking,
planète,
oh, okay, let's.
je veux descendre, je l'aime plus.
I no longer
La
like this
planète,
planet. I
elle
want to
continue
get
à évoluer parce
off.
que nous sommes des
No,
êtres
the planet is
évolutifs.
going to
Et nos
continue to
grammaires changent et
evolve
on doit
because
tout le
we
temps les
are
adapter.
evolving
Nos langues
beings.
changent.
We always have
On
to
aura
adapt our
bientôt,
grammars.
peut-être
Our
dans 10,
languages
15 ans,
change. In
des
10, 15
micropuces
years,
qu'on
we
mettra
might
dans des
have
oreilles,
microchips in our
on me
ears.
parlera en arabe, en
And
chinois,
you
en
could
russe,
speak
et je
Arab,
comprendrai
Chinese, Russian, and
parfaitement,
I
vous
would
imaginez
perfectly understand you.
ce que cela
Just
changera
imagine
dans l'humanité. Ça va
the change this would be
bouleverser
for
complètement.
humanity.
D'un
It
coup,
would
on se
overhaul
comprend.
everything.
En tout cas, un point
We
de
could
vue
suddenly
des mots,
understand
peut-être
each
pas un point de
other.
vue humour,
Okay,
peut-être
in terms
pas
of
d'autres
words,
éléments
maybe
de la
not in terms
compréhension.
of love or
Donc,
other elements of understanding.
On est destiné à
We are
bâtir
destined
des constructions sociales
to build social constructs
sur des collectivités
based
humaines qui
on
évoluent.
human groups
Alors,
which are
l'ONU est
constantly
une construction
evolving.
sociale
The UN is a social
qui a,
construct.
pour l'instant, qui n'a pas d'alternative, donc qui est
There's no
très
alternative
précieuse,
for now, so it's
mais qui
very
vieillit
precious,
comme
but
construction
it is getting
sociale.
older.
Et on a beaucoup de peine
And
à la
we're having
transformer, à la
the
faire
greatest
évoluer
difficulty
avec
in making
le
it
monde
evolve,
qui
in
évolue.
transforming
Et
it
je crois que c'est une partie du
in
problème.
pace with the changing world. And I think that's part of the
Je
problem.
partage à 100%
I
l'analyse du professeur
completely
Salamé.
share
C'est une analyse
Professor
très
Salome's
lucide et très
analysis,
claire.
which
La
is very
question,
lucid and very
de
clear.
fond est se dire, OK, ça
The
c'est
basic
exactement
question
ce qui est en train
is,
d'arriver.
yes, okay, this is what's happening.
Je me rappelle quand le mur
I
de Berlin est
remember
tombé
when
et
the
puis
Berlin
l'Union
Wall
soviétique est tombée,
fell and
Fukuyama
then the
avait écrit
Soviet
ce fameux
Union
livre,
collapsed,
La fin de
and
l'histoire.
Fukuyama wrote the book on the
Voilà,
end of
on y est,
history.
c'est bon, on est fini.
Okay,
Maintenant,
all
récréation
done,
pour le futur.
and now
Non,
everybody's in recess
malheureusement,
for
c'est
the
pas
future.
ça.
Unfortunately,
C'était une
that's not
illusion de
what
penser
happened. That
que
was an
tombée
illusion,
l'Union soviétique,
thinking
finie la
that
guerre
with the
froide,
fall of the Soviet
on aurait
Union
pu,
and the end of the Cold War,
embrasser un monde
that everybody was
en
going to
parfaite
be
harmonie. Et
friends
ça,
and
et
live
je
in
rejoins ce
harmony
que j'ai dit tout
forever.
au départ, parce
And
que
to go back
l'être
to what I
humain n'est
said in
pas
the
un être
beginning,
qui
humans aren't beings.
je crois que c'est naïf si on pense, mais c'est pas
I would be
pessimisme, c'est
naive, and this
réalisme.
isn't
C'est naïf de
pessimism, it's
penser que l'être humain
realism,
évite
to
les
think
conflits
that
et ne fera
humans
pas la
avoid
guerre.
conflicts and avoid
On
war.
le voit même dans des petites
We even
expressions
see it in the
démocratiques dont je parlais tout à l'heure avec mes
democratic
collaborateurs.
expressions,
Dans
as
des
I was
petites
saying
communes
earlier.
en Suisse,
In small
où
municipalities
dans
in Switzerland,
l'organe législatif de la commune,
and
je
the
parle de communes de
legislative
5 000, 6 000,
organs
7 000
of
personnes,
the
dans l'organe législatif, un
for
parti
5,000,
a la
6,000
majorité
people,
absolue.
one party
Les
has
guerres
absolute
commencent à l'intérieur
majority.
du parti.
Guards start within
Alors que
the
tout le
party.
monde est riche, va bien.
The
Le seul
world-
problème, c'est de choisir où on va faire
Sorry,
une
the
nouvelle
people
route, où on va faire, si on va
are
faire de la piscine ou non
wealthy,
pour
and
la
it's a
collectivité.
matter of
C'est
making
les
a new
problèmes
road
que nous
or a
avons,
new swimming
quelque
pool.
part
These are the
aussi en
kind
Suisse, hein.
of problems that we
Et
have in
sur ces problèmes, on
Switzerland.
se fait des petites guerres.
Yet, even
Même
with
à
these type
l'intérieur
of
du parti,
problems,
si on a une
small
majorité
wars
absolue.
are
Donc,
being
moi, en
waged,
tant que
even with
médecin,
parties that have an
j'ai
absolute
étudié
majority.
l'être humain et
I
je
have
vois
studied
Après
the
60
human
ans, c'est exactement ce
being.
que j'ai étudié. J'ai la preuve tous
For
les
60
jours que
years,
ce qu'on m'a enseigné à
I have studied
l'université est
this,
la vérité.
and I'm
Et
finding out
difficilement
now that
je
what
peux
I
me
learned at
persuader
university
avant de mourir que ce sera différent.
was
Voilà.
right, and
Et je
I'm
suis prêt à changer
sure
d'idée si
that
on m'invite,
even
si
after
on
I'm
m'invite
gone, things will still
à me
be
le donner.
the
Maintenant,
same.
là, comment interpréter ce qui se
Now,
passe dans
how
le
to
continent
interpret
européen?
what is
Pourquoi
happening
hier,
on the
il y a-
European
juste ici
continent?
derrière, il y avait
Yesterday,
universalisme et puis double standards.
here we were talking
Western
about
et
universalism, double standards, East and
On s'est
West.
réveillé en
We,
Suisse comme en Europe avec
in
les
Switzerland,
militaires russes
woke up, like in Europe,
qui
with Russian military,
sont en train de faire une invasion.
the
en
Russian
Ukraine.
military that was invading Ukraine.
Nous étions sans vocabulaire.
We had no
La grammaire
words.
n'a pas changé, la grammaire nous a manqué. On
The
n'avait même pas
grammar
la
was
grammaire
missing. We
adéquate
did
pour le
not
dire.
have the adequate
Ah,
grammar to
on
describe the
était à tel point
situation.
convaincus,
We were so
grâce à
convinced,
l'ONU, grâce
thanks
au
to the
drame de la Deuxième
UN,
Guerre mondiale,
and thanks
que
to the
ceci,
tragedy of World War II,
jamais
that
plus
this
on
would
aurait pu,
never
on aurait dû, on
ever
aurait pu, on aurait vu ça.
have happened
Alors que d'un
again.
coup, c'est là.
Yet
Et
it
on a
did.
été comme paralysés, tétanisés par une
We were
situation
completely paralyzed by this
qui n'avait pas
situation.
d'explication rationnelle.
This had
On
no
cherchait,
rational
nous, les cultivés,
explanation.
à
We,
donner un nom, à
the
donner un
cultured
descriptif, et on ne trouvait
people,
pas.
tried to describe the situation, but we
Et je dis
couldn't.
quelque chose qui n'est peut-être pas très politiquement
And
correct.
I'm going to say something that may not be
On
quite
voyait bien sûr la guerre en Syrie, on voyait
politically
bien sûr
correct.
la guerre au Yémen, en
In
Libye,
the Syrian war, in
Afghanistan,
Yemen, in
etc.
Afghanistan, in Libya,
Et c'est des choses qu'on ne dit pas, mais on se dit,
We never
c'est
say
normal,
this,
ils sont à
but
un autre stade de
we sort of
développement.
say, yes, well, it's
Donc,
normal
il y
because
avait
they're
un
at a
peu
different
cette,
stage of
cette
development.
supériorité,
So there's this sense of
cette
superiority,
morale qui disait,
this sort of
nous y étions
moral
aussi, mais voilà, ça arrivera
stance
pour eux
that
aussi.
says, well,
C'est
we
une
were there
question
once
de
too,
temps.
and
Faut juste
it's just a question
attendre.
of time.
Et puis, la
Just
Syrie, la
need to
Libye,
give it
etc.,
some
tout ça,
time,
ça
and
fait-
these countries,
Quand il y a eu
Yemen
le
and Syria,
printemps
will
arabe, c'était ça l'espoir.
will sort
On se
themselves
disait,
out, and that's
voilà,
what
on
the
a vu
hopes of the
maintenant
Arab
ce qu'on
Spring
causait
was
avec
as
le printemps
well.
arabe, au Sahel, dans toute la,
The
dans
Arab
toute
Spring
la-
in
la
the Sahel
région là-bas.
region.
Donc, pour terminer, l'Ukraine,
to
l'invasion
conclude,
militaire russe en Ukraine
The Russian invasion
nous
of
met
Ukraine
face
is
à
now
ceux
making
qu'on a
us
voulu
face
cotomiser, ne plus
what
voir.
we wanted to no longer
L'être humain.
see,
Il est
and that
comme
is
ça.
the
Et
nature of human
Donc,
beings.
poser la question, so what? Qu'est-ce qu'on
So,
fait maintenant?
so what do we do
Comment
now?
réagir?
How do we react?
L'architecture de sécurité
The
du
security
continent européen
architecture
qui a
of
un
the
peu un
European
complexe
continent,
de
which
supériorité par rapport à la
has a
planète,
superiority
évidemment,
complex
l'histoire qu'il y a eu,
because of
d'un coup,
its
être
history,
fragilisé,
is now
insécurisé.
suddenly
On a une
fragile
organisation pour
and
la sécurité et la
insecure.
coopération en
We
Europe
have
qui est
there is
paralysée.
an organization
C'est
for
elle
security
qui
in
a
Europe,
créé
but it's
l'architecture
paralyzed,
avec la charte
and
de
that's the
Stockholm en
organization that
1975. Et actuellement, on
created
sait
the
pas très
Stockholm
bien
architecture in
comment
1975.
est-ce qu'on peut réparer ça?
How
Quels sont les
can
pas à faire?
we
Quel est le
remedy
format
this situation?
européen qui
What
permettra de reconstruire
is the European
cette
formula that will
architecture
enable
de
us to
sécurité sur notre
restore this
continent? Le
security
président Macron
architecture
on the continent. President Macron had this idea, and I congratulated him yesterday, because there are some countries, such as France, that look at reality beyond 50, 100 years and have this circular vision as well. President Macron said that we need to launch this idea, this vision of a European political community. Now, there's the European Union unit that is a family with common rules, etc. But for some countries of this continent, that's too binding. But we need to speak with other countries. And so let's do that. And this is why the President and the Czech Republic President also mentioned this as well. 44 heads of state of this continent are meeting, that are meeting, eating, drinking together, and just go beyond the European Union member states. Now, Ukraine is now forcing us to look at the future of the continent. What will it look like? China is no longer this country of 1.2 billion inhabitants, 1 billion of which were under the poverty line. That's no longer the case. Nor is it the case for India. Southeast Asia, neither. In Africa, there are the lions, these countries that are advancing dramatically, whose population is also exploding. In Europe, we're sort of stuck in the vision of Fukuyama that history is over. I'm going to end on a quote. There's a very wonderful book by an author, Rachman, that's called The Age of the Strong Man. And it's a very lucid vision. He says that humans have this in their genetics, in their DNA. So we need to find ways. And this is what Prime Minister Salamé was saying. The fundamental question is, okay, this is reality. What do we do with it? There's no point in saying we need cooperation. Who's we? If we want democracy, then the people must want it. But does the people want it? And this is a classic conflict dilemma. So we want democracy, but we only want democracy if it's in line with what I think. And if there's a disagreement, then that's not exactly what we want either. So this is why there's no clear answer. And we need to find an answer to each specific period of our history.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Minister, go ahead. Yes, there's a few things that I wanted to mention. The impact of the international community. So the impact cannot be measured yet because the war is not yet over. But what can be observed at this stage, and it's devastating observation, is that today the paralysis of this observation is the paralysis of the UN that was created to prevent war. But today there is a member of the Security Council that is vetoing all resolutions on war. So what to do in this situation? We need to think further about the UN. We've talked a lot about the reform of the UN, and this conversation has been happening for 20 years now. But things aren't going ahead. The Security Council reform is not going ahead. Why not? What can the UN do with a permanent member that is vetoing everything and that is carrying out an attack on another member of the UN? So if the UN cannot face this kind of situation, then it means that this organization is having issues with its working, with how it works, and it will have in the future. Indeed, it's food for thought, because we cannot revise the UN Charter if within the members of the Security Council, one member is not in agreement. There are 192 members, even if 992 members agree and the 193rd doesn't, then it's over. no change can be made. So we need to think about this system that's been around for 115 years, and now that it needs to be adapted to this new world and its challenges. I don't have the answer to this. Second point, regarding war, today, food is being used as a weapon, and energy is being weaponized too. You talked about the new grammar, but what about the new vocabulary? This is a new type of war that we're seeing. Using food, energy as weapons is extremely serious. I remember Medvedev's speech in which he said, we will provide food and agricultural products to our friends only. That is extremely serious. And today, what can we do in the face of this situation to combat the weaponization of energy and food? What is available in international humanitarian law? Nothing. There's the Status of Rome, Article 8, paragraph 27, I quote, deliberately starving civilians as part of warfare by preventing them access to what they need for survival, including deliberately preventing humanitarian access, constitutes a weapon of war. So, what sanctions are provided for? A member of the UN Security Council is using food and energy as war. What to do? Thank you.
Avant de laisser Kassan répondre, je vous signale qu'il nous reste une dizaine de minutes, donc on prendra les questions après l'intervention.
The next panelists answer. Maybe a member of the audience would like to ask a question. I haven't got great eyesight, so please raise your hand. Well, you mentioned the impact of the war in Ukraine on the international system. Now, there's one particular impact that is in fact insulting for the majority of humanity. So there's war in Europe. Hey guys, there's war everywhere. It's as if Europeans were immune to war. This sort of surprise, this surprise has really bothered a lot of people in India, in Arab countries, in South Africa. They were shocked. No. Not everyone can go to war, and Europeans too. Now, Europe is no longer an exception. This hurts because what Europe has been able to do over the past 70 years is to be a permanent source of regulation and rule of law. And now, war invading the continent, it was a shock. But maybe the way that this was expressed sort of upset many people around the world. The second impact that I think is fundamental, and that is the change in the balance of power in Europe. Now, this war in Ukraine may end with the unexpected military pole being Ukraine and Poland rather than Italy or Spain or France and the UK. That is, that the power, the force, is moving within the European continent. And I think that that needs to be taken into account because it can create tensions within the continent. Third impact that I think it's really important to mention, and Thomas, you mentioned this, and that's that an end has come to the nuclear taboo. 20 years ago, Madame Tannenbaum wrote a book about the nuclear taboo. So that is that war could be waged in 1997 between India and Pakistan without even the mention of brandishing the threat of using nuclear weapons, because there is this taboo surrounding the use of nuclear weapons. But the war in Ukraine has shown us that a nuclear power can brandish nuclear war, and Mr. Medvedev sort of did this on a daily basis. nuclear weapons can be brandished on a daily basis. And we also, and there's this sort of argument where you see people saying, yes, well, we've got a nuclear weapon too. And that's very serious because it means that now nuclear weapons can be brandished. And countries like France and the United States that have recognized nuclear power and others that are not recognized, like North Korea, Israel, or Pakistan, and so on, that can also today use the end of this nuclear taboo. And I think it's extremely frightening. Last, nowadays, warfare has collateral effects. Now, this is good and bad news. It means bad news because it means that grain, fertilizers are impacted by the war in Ukraine. But it also means, on the other hand, that if we cannot put an end to the war in Ukraine, then some collateral factors can be set aside and come to agreements on some aspects, such as the grain agreement, thanks to the UN and Turkey. This agreement was suspended for a few years, but is now back on track. And I know it very well. And there's a very strong there are very strong efforts being made to do the same thing for fertilizers. So if we cannot solve the war, at least we can solve some aspects of this war. Then the P5, the veto members of the Security Council. Remember the war of France in Algeria? No one could attack France at the Security Council. Remember China in Tibet or China in Taiwan? Nobody could act because China would veto. Remember the invasion of Crimea in 2014? No one could counter Russia. Now, this is a core issue, but I'm going to say one thing, and that's when we criticize rightfully the UN, it's in fact self-criticism, because UN belongs to all of us. The UN was created by states and peoples, and if there's not a people's movement that will encourage states to change this system that is archaic in many ways, then it will never change.
Alors, il nous reste 3 minutes 47.
We have 3 minutes and 47 seconds left. I'm going to ask the people I'm going to give the floor to briefly ask their questions and maybe select one panelist to answer. Sir, Madam, and Sir. Hello, I have a question for the President. So, your visits in Moldova and in Ukraine, did this give you any hope? What you discovered, did it source of hope for people that haven't yet visited? Sir, yes, on my right, so your left. Hello. I'm a journalist in security and a coordinator of the G5 Sahel group. When war broke out in Ukraine, I thought it was surprising that there was a war in the 21st century. It is surprising, but I also thought, what are Nobel Peace Prizes for? Maybe beyond the UN, Nobel Peace Prizes could be a sort of more friendly forum to prevent wars around the world. Thank you. Now, first row, so go ahead, and that will be it.
Monsieur Galigata du Chad.
Monsieur, my name is Galigata, I'm from Chad. Now, I have passionately listened to what you described as a situation in the Central African Republic. But what about Chad? How is Chad's situation now, Cameroon, Sudan, Nigeria, around this country? And Minister, in that case, we could say that all of African neighbors are in some sense bad neighbors.
Deuxième chose, j'ai écouté
Second, I listened to the Swiss president and the other panelist. This proliferation of war and conflict was mentioned. And why are we seeing such powerlessness in face of these events? Is it because these tools of the Second World War are really no longer relevant? Or is it a lack of creativity? The humans are lacking inspiration for finding tools to live in peace? And finally, who are responsible for these wars? Thank you. Now, thank you for being brief. We've got 1 minute left, so we're going to change the order. So what about the question about Nobel Prizes? Maybe Minister, you could answer, and maybe Minister, you could answer the question about the question of neighboring countries in Africa. And maybe you could add a suggestion for the situation in the Central African Republic. And President, beyond what you remember from your visits, but maybe you could end on a suggestion as well. Nobel Prizes are symbolic prizes that have sort of lost a bit of their significance given the acts and the actions of some laureates, such as the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. So I don't think we can really count on them, but I would go even further and say maybe these countries that say that they want war, are they actually seeking it? And I'm going to give you a snippet of my experience in Libya. One thing I can say, I am 100% convinced that no country will enable a peace agreement if those involved do not want it. So Libyans need to wake up and understand that no country wants to become a humanitarian dependent country, and their interests must be focusing on in restoring peace. Thank you. I don't know what the best neighbours are in countries. I don't know if Senegal has good neighbours. Maybe Madagascar, in fact, has the best neighbours since it doesn't have any borders. But let's focus on the role of the region and the impact of the region on crises, the crises that are ongoing in some countries. So the crisis in the Central African Republic have repercussions on other countries. In Chad, there's this crisis that is still ongoing between Chad and the Central African Republic, when the infiltration of Central African soldiers to Chad that were then repatriated. This crisis is ongoing, and they're trying to seek an agreement on this. But let's focus on the role of the region. So, in Central African Republic, now for years, the system hasn't awoken, and there are some organizations like ECOWAS that need to improve.
So we need to make sure we can have a stronger impact on those countries in crisis, whether it's Chad or the Central African Republic. Thank you, President. The last word, and perhaps a concrete suggestion or path towards hope. Well, this will be challenging, but I'll attempt something. First, I'd like to say about what gives me hope when I visit Ukraine. Well, the human being, the same human being that causes war, gives me hope when I see President Zelensky, my friend Kuliba, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and their commitment, their authentic commitment. Your authentic commitment is what gives me hope. Second, now what can we do? Well, I have no clue. I think that for years and millennia, human beings have been trying to find the solution. I think I will die before a solution is found. All I can do is to observe what has been done in my country all throughout my life, Switzerland. The last time we were nearing an internal conflict was just after World War I, a little over 100 years ago, when there was a large-scale strike, and the military had to step in, and there were a few deaths. Since then, Switzerland managed to live for an entire century in peace. And Switzerland has seen its borders not move for 5 centuries. So, given that we also belong to a variety of cultures, German, Italian, French in Switzerland, we are quite different in our cultural differences in Switzerland. So, we are taught at the youngest age in Switzerland to solve conflicts peacefully. There's a bit of an obsession with respect to peace in Switzerland because of such strong differences. We also decentralized power. We're allergic to any concentration of power. I've been president of Switzerland since January, and it will be my term will end in December, and then in January there will be a new president. This speaks to a country that is scared of concentrating power because it's always very risky. Could this be a food for thought? Well, at any rate, it seems to be delivering good results in Switzerland, and I hope this will still be the case.
Bien, je n'ai pas de temps de conclure, donc c'est une bonne nouvelle.
I'm short of time to wrap up. This is good news, therefore. I just want to say one word. I think the theme of this panel, of this 5th edition of the Paris Peace Forum, calls for a new session on the same theme for the 6th edition of the Paris Peace Forum. So we'll meet with you next year to carry on with this conversation. Thank you very much to all of you.